So tonight, we welcome back photographer Bruce Magnuson. After retiring from a career in financial services, Chelmsford resident Bruce Magnuson has pursued his interests in photography, art, and history. He has had photographs in multiple shows at the Griffin Museum in Winchester and various other venues, including one featuring his infrared photographs at the Acton Library. Through the Learning in Retirement program at UMass Lowell, he has presented a wide variety of topics ranging from international affairs, social justice, photography, and the history of his home region in the Hudson River Valley, which we will find out more about tonight. So tonight we will take a trip down the Hudson, only 3 hours away, but rich in history from the Ice Age up to the current day. Albany, New York area native and Chelmsford resident, Bruce Magnuson, will guide you through this fascinating region. He'll touch upon historical, cultural, and artistic themes that capture the essence of the area. While weaving in some of his photographs, he will show how many of the major themes in American history have shown up in this small section of the country. And it is remarkably beautiful. I spent some time there. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Mr. Magnuson. Thank you so much for coming back online with us.
Well, thanks, Jess. Thanks for hosting, and thanks to the Chelmsford Library. And I guess I'll go through my sources at the end, but most of my sources came from books in the Merrimack Valley Library Consortium. So appropriate that they're hosting this. And thanks everybody for joining. I see that actually I don't recognize anybody in the list except for a former coworker of Steve Brown. So I guess that's good or bad, but we'll take a trip down the Hudson. So just mentioned that I had a show of infrared photographs a couple of years ago before the pandemic at Acton Library. And this is one of them here. We'll get into more of them in the presentation. I typically take my infrareds during the summer for various reasons, but this is actually the Hudson River, the bend around West Point. And as we go through the presentation, we'll see more of my photos, both color and black and white infrared. Here's my contact information. I'll show that at the end. And we'll go into the agenda of what we're going to cover this year. As I said in the title, it's 13,000 years from the beginning of the end of the Ice Age up until today. And we'll focus on basically the history, Ice Age, American Indians, the Dutch and English, Revolutionary War, transportation, the Hudson River School of Painting, and the Gilded Age mansions, which will basically take us up until about 1900. And then we'll jump into a recent view of the valley. And fortunately, my wife and I actually were recently just down in the Hudson River Valley last week. So we have some very, very recent images. So just so everybody's kind of oriented as to what we're talking about here, this is the Hudson River in eastern New York. And it starts up here in the Adirondack Mountains, has, excuse me, a tributary from the Mohawk that goes in around Troy, New York, and empties into New York Harbor on the west side of Manhattan. And a little more specifically, this is what we're talking about, is this is how it is organized politically, or I guess geographically, within the counties of New York State. Basically, the counties are on the west or the east side of the river. The upper Hudson River Valley around Albany, middle around Poughkeepsie, and the lower Hudson River just north of New York City in Westchester and Rockland counties. And these are some of the towns and sites we'll be visiting. This is Hudson up here in the upper valley, Albany, actually north of here is Saratoga. You see Poughkeepsie kind of right in the middle, which is basically about an hour and a half from Albany and about an hour and a half from the city. And then you see we have here Storm King Arts Center. This is West Point on the west side of it. And going down here are some of the mansions. This is Kykuit, which is the Rockefeller Mansion, and Sunnyside, which is Washington Irving's mansion. So with those two maps, hopefully folks are oriented and understanding where we're going. And we'll go in the Wayback Machine and go to the Ice Age, which is very important to us here in the Northeast as far as how our topography is defined. The Ice Age, basically the ice sheet, the Laurentide ice sheet, started retreating about 13,500 years ago. And you see a lot of these landmarks that we know today. This is basically Lake Ontario. We have the Adirondack Mountains here. We go here, this is kind of where the Mohawk River is. And then here we go into the Catskills and we go down south. And we have a thing here called Lake Albany. It's a little bit blurry here, but that's Lake Albany. And where I grew up actually are yard was very sandy, and my brother, who's 4 years older than me, came home from school one day and said, "Oh, this used to be a lake bed." And of course, as somebody who was probably like 6 years old at the time, I couldn't really process that. But indeed, this was a lake for a while, and the soil is actually very reminiscent of a lake bed and very sandy and doesn't hold water that well. So as the ice sheet retreats, creates an ice dam, which those of us here in New England, unfortunately, are fairly familiar with. And it kind of sends this torrent of water that pretty much creates what is the Hudson River Valley. And you'll see that actually the land was farther out than it is today. So the shoreline is here back 13,400 years ago. And then this dotted line here is where it is today at Long Island and New Jersey here. So this pushes out. There's actually kind of some very, very deep valleys within the Atlantic Ocean here as the Hudson River emptied. And basically this glacier kind of created this natural entity, which we call the Hudson River Valley. And this is a picture I took from the, up here is the Helderberg Escarpment, which is basically the foothills of the Catskills. And you can see very definitively here with the topographical map of the Hudson River Valley. And this photo, I'm up here in a town called Voorheesville, very Dutch name. And you're looking over in the haze to actually the Empire State Plaza and the Albert E. Smith Building here in downtown Albany. So it gives you a pretty good, here the Taconic Mountains here on the east and the Berkshires behind the Taconics. And so you see right here as to how all this is really defined. And it is a very, very defined valley here in eastern New York. You can see here's the Taconic Mountains and there's the Berkshires. So first known inhabitants of Homo sapiens are the American Indians. And this is a map of the tribes that were in the valley. It was a bit forward. When I was in 7th grade, which was a long time ago, we actually did pretty much the whole year on the Iroquois Indians. So, this is 45, 50 years ago. We actually studied for a whole year. And so obviously a lot of influence in the area. These tribes, one thing you kind of learn with this is, these markers are very, very fluid. But you see here, you kind of have what are the Iroquois, the 5 Six Nation Iroquois tribes. And then you get into here over to what is in New England. A lot of the tribes, the Mohegan are the ones that officially kind of had the Hudson River Valley, but like I said, it was very fluid. The Mohawk, which is the eastern edge of the Iroquois Nation, they certainly went over here into this space. The Delaware, also known as the Lenape, they're in the southern Hudson River Valley and actually go down to what is current day Philadelphia. So very active and very diverse tribal entities around here within New England and upstate New York. And a couple of tidbits on the various tribes. The Mohegan, as I said, their name is derived from Mohicanuic, which is people of the ever-flowing waters, which refers to the Hudson River Valley. And the Haudenosaunee, which is a term I wasn't certainly familiar with when we were studying. The Iroquois is actually a French term, but the native term is Haudenosaunee, and that means the people of the Longhouse. It is a confederacy. Like I said, it was 5 nations. Originally became 6 when the Tuscarora moved up from North Carolina. The story of Hiawatha is their origin story. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but in 1754, Benjamin Franklin used their model of a confederacy to talk about uniting the colonies together. And he thought that would be a model for the colonies. Now, Benjamin Franklin has some issues. He did call them savages, so he wasn't all forward thinking to a certain degree, but he also did realize that this, confederacy and bonding together was stronger than individual entities. And like I said, the easternmost tribe was the Mohawk. And they had semi-permanent settlements, which moved about every 10 years or so. And we'll get into the longhouses in the next slide. And like I mentioned, the Lenape, the Delaware, they were in the lower Hudson Valley and in the Delaware River area, which is the southern part of what we're talking about. So the people of the Longhouse are the Iroquois, and this is a longhouse. And this is a cross section of a model. This is obviously a painting of a longhouse, and this actually is a longhouse in the New York State Museum in Albany. And this has been there for decades because I saw it as a kid. And as far as I know, it's still there. I haven't been to that museum in about 10 or 15 years, but I believe it's still there. And it's fascinating that they basically had multiple families lived in these dwellings. And like I said, they were semi-permanent permanent settlements. They lived about 10 years or so. When their hunting grounds and the soil got fallow, they would move. So they weren't, cities per se, but they were semi-permanent structures. And it was a pretty defining. They're not, I mean, longhouses are not unique to the Iroquois. There are other places. The Vikings actually used longhouses, but within the Native Americans, certainly in the East, I think the Iroquois were the only ones who predominantly used longhouses. And then the Dutch come along. So in the early 1600s, a lot of exploration going on. There's, various explorers coming from France and from Portugal. And you're seeing some colonies being set up, fishing and fur trapping. And fur trapping becomes actually a very, very big defining feature as to why these areas get settled. And Henry Hudson, who was actually an Englishman, but he was working for the Dutch East India Company, who in Dutch his initials VOC, and his crew was half English and half Dutch, which gets interesting because the reason he was sailing for the Dutch is the English wouldn't sponsor him. Once he starts finding stuff, all of a sudden the English are like, hey, let's claim one of our own. So that became kind of a problem when he came back after one of his voyages. But as you find out in history, a lot of times in history, things happen not on purpose. So he's done multiple voyages trying to find the Northeast and the Northwest Passage. So this is going to the Northwest, trying to get through the Arctic here. And this is a way going around Russia, trying to find the Northeast Passage, once again, to find quicker routes to China and the Southeast. So on his voyage that he actually discovers the Hudson River, he was funded for a Northeast Passage, and he had been on some Northwest passages before, and that's where he thought that was the most viable way of finding a route to where he was going to. So he goes this way and basically says, I think I want to go the other way. So he stops this way, turns around, and goes back. Goes back and ends up coming into the Hudson River in 1609 and basically disobeying orders. And his ship is the Half Moon. It's actually a town on the Hudson River, a little bit north of Albany, called Half Moon. And so that ends up being the establishment. The Dutch, very interested in this. Once again, they're more interested in fur trading, but that's the impetus for them to start settling this area. And it becomes New Netherland, and it is bounded on the south by the Delaware River. On the north, this is the North River, which is the Hudson River. And it's called the North River, I believe, until like the middle 1800s. It doesn't start off being named the Hudson River. And then the eastern edge of it is the Connecticut River, which was known as Fresh River. So basically, New Netherlands becomes the seat here. Albany is up in here, and actually in some ways is actually even a bigger metropolis, because that's where a lot of the fur trading is coming at. And they basically end up with this kind of hodgepodge of residents, and you have all a mix of languages and everything else. It is a real, true melting pot of all these people who are basically trying to make their fortune in the New World. And they do have some abortive attempts at representative government even in the 1640s. So unfortunately, the story also includes slavery. So the Dutch do introduce slaves from African males in the 1626, very early on. And by 1630, slaves were 1/3 of the population. And before the Revolution, actually, New York and Albany were among the biggest slave markets in the colonies. And emancipation does not come to New York until 1827, which is the last northern state to abolish slavery, second to last, before New Jersey in 1860. And you also have the kind of unique to the Dutch influence here is the patroon system, what is now Rensselaer and Albany counties. If you remember from the map, those are in the upper valley on the east and the west and the east side of the river. And it is kind of a Middle Ages paradigm. They have these patroons who own this land. They're kind of a nobility. They have tenant farmers. They have slaves. Actually, the original Shaker village in Watervliet, which is just outside of Albany, leased their land from the Van Rensselaer patroon. And I will be doing a talk on the Shakers in the fall. And so they do have a connection to this whole patroon system that was all along the Hudson River Valley. But then, as the English do, they take New Amsterdam in 1644 without really firing a shot. But they leave most of the policies intact. So if you know, England and the colonies at this time is pretty much Jamestown, Plymouth Colony, and Massachusetts Bay Colony. So Jamestown's Anglican, the Plymouth is kind of a separatist colony, and Massachusetts Bay is the Puritans, who are Anglican, but they want to purify the church. So you have these, not relatively, very strong religious entities all surrounding, but the English take New Netherland and New Amsterdam and basically kind of leave things in place, which is kind of how the English do a lot of things when they go out and, quote unquote, conquer. They do kind of leave things and people to kind of continue as it's going, because it was pretty successful as a trading area. And then the Dutch actually take it back in 1673. And then it gets hot, kind of ping pong back and forth. And eventually, if you remember the Glorious Revolution, I think it's called, is when William and Mary come over from Holland and basically become installed as King and Queen of England. So at this point, whether it's Dutch or English, they're all kind of the same at this thing, and it goes forward as being an English/British after the Scottish joined England in the early 1700s. But as we'll see, there's a lot of residual with the Dutch influence there, and it is unique in the history of America because the really Dutch don't have any other major establishment within the United States except in the New Amsterdam and Netherlands region. And you see it today: Martin van Buren, a president, the Vanderbilts. Obviously, we'll get to them with some of their mansions. The name Roosevelt, and even Springsteen is actually a Dutch name. And interestingly enough, the term boss comes from the Dutch term of baas, meaning master. So a lot of influence from the Dutch in the early history of the United States. And to kind of expand upon that, we'll watch a quick video that kind of puts all this together.
When the Dutch settled in what is now present-day New York, which was then called New Netherlands, it was to establish a stronghold in the fur trade in America. Their primary seaport towns were called New Amsterdam, located on Manhattan Island, and Fort Orange in present-day Albany.
They're, in a way, less interested, I think, in colonization than they are in trade. They were interested in New York, I think, because of the Hudson River. The principal Dutch settlement was at Albany, which was the major international crossroads. Indian people from all over brought furs to Albany, and even people from Massachusetts would come to Albany for these kind of international arrangements.
To encourage farmers from Holland to settle the colony, the Dutch instituted the patroon system, which gave proprietors the rights to large tracts of land in the colony. These wealthy promoters, who brought at least 50 people to New Netherlands, were rewarded with expansive estates along the Hudson River. These patroonships lent the area a decidedly aristocratic air. At the seaport of New Amsterdam, located on Manhattan Island, a French Jesuit missionary visiting in the 1640s reported hearing 18 different European and African languages spoken, and African slaves were treated differently in the Dutch colony than in others.
Although there were enslaved Africans in New York, they had a different kind of status. They had more control over their own lives than enslaved Africans did in the English or the Spanish colonies.
As the Dutch settlements grew rapidly, the wealthy investors of the colony appointed a series of tyrannical governors who savagely repressed religious dissenters and local Indian tribes. Despite the cosmopolitan nature of New Amsterdam, investors in the colony had no interest in promoting religious freedom, diversity, or democracy. Aggravated settlers protested their treatment by local officials and speculators who demanded early returns on their investments. Eventually, the company permitted colonists to establish an assembly with limited lawmaking powers. In 1664, the English king, Charles II, jealously eyed the New Netherlands. Ignoring Dutch claims, he granted the area to his brother, the Duke of York, and sent a squadron to New Amsterdam to ensure Dutch compliance.
An English fleet came and seized New Amsterdam in 1664. And by that time, I think the Dutch interests were elsewhere. I mean, I think that it was partly that the Dutch were less interested in defending New Amsterdam than perhaps they had been earlier.
The irascible, one-legged Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, surrendered without firing a shot, and New Amsterdam became New York. After this victory, the English flag flew triumphantly from Maine to the Carolinas. Though memories of Dutch power quickly receded in North America, the cultural contributions persist to this day. It was the Dutch who introduced names like Harlem and Brooklyn, and activities like bowling, sleigh riding, skating, and golf, as well as American cultural classics like waffles, Easter eggs, and Santa Claus.
Okay, so I'm going to use my hometown is Guilderland, New York, which is outside of Albany. And it's kind of interesting microcosm in a lot of the different elements that we've seen within the Hudson River Valley. So our nickname was the Dutchman, and our symbol was the Flying Dutchman ship. I will admit, as a child, I always thought Guilderland was named Guilderland because of the gilder, the Dutch gilder, but it turns out that's actually not the case. So here it is, right here. Actually, I grew up right on my parents' backyard, actually abutted the city of Albany. So here in Western Albany, and this is the whole Albany County with the Hudson River going down here, and the Norman's Kill, which is the major quote unquote river that goes through Guilderland. So, like I said, its term is Guilderland, from a section in the Netherlands. So it has a Dutch influence. It was part of the Van der Rensselaer Patroon on the west side of the Hudson River. The major park is an Indian named Tawasenta, which means Valley of Tears. The first shopping center in town is Stuyvesant Plaza, which of course is named for the governor of New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant. And like I said, the major water that goes through it is the Norman's Kill, which kill being the Dutch word for basically creek, river. I guess it's pretty much anything, river, creek, stream, whatever. And there were loyalists and revolutionary skirmishes here, which once again, I didn't really pay that much attention to, but there was a Battle of Norman's Kill fought in 1777, I believe in August. And so when I went to school, we had a relatively long bus ride, as my house was here and the school in Guilderland, quote unquote, center is here, although all the population's over here. So I had a good 15, 20, 30 minutes on the bus every morning at some ungodly hour at 6:45, 6:45 or so, and my head against the window on the right side of the 146 with this marker I'd look at literally every day, and never really thought that much about it. And this Battle of Norman's Kill was, like I said, fought in August of 1777, and it was a skirmish between Tories or loyalists, which were basically United States residents who were loyal to the king, and Rhode Island troops. And so where that becomes important is both my parents were from the Boston area. So when you learn about the Revolution, certainly around here, obviously Lexington and Concord, this being, of course, the old North Bridge and Concord in infrared. And, that is the be all. And basically, the Revolutionary War, for all intents and purposes, kind of ends here in March of 1776 when the English evacuate Boston after the cannons are brought from Ticonderoga to Dorchester Heights, which once again is a fascinating story overlooking to what Henry Knox did to get those cannons from Ticonderoga, which is actually north of Lake George. But for myself, the be-all end-all was the Battle of Saratoga. And so what this is, in 1777, the plan for the British was for Johnny Burgoyne to come down from Canada, which of course they had gotten Canada in the 7 Years' War back in the 1750s. And the plan was to split the colonies in half, and he was going to come down from the north. Henry Clinton was going to come up from the south, and Barry St. Leger was going to come from the west. And they were going to meet around Albany and basically split the colonies. And so New England would be cut off from the rest of the colonies, and that would be a huge, devastating blow to the war effort. Of course, it doesn't go that way. And so he is defeated at Saratoga. It's actually multiple battles happened at Saratoga in September and October of 1777, and the battle literally is on the banks of the Hudson River. So you have the Hudson River here, and this is the battlefield, which is a national monument right now. It's beautiful to go to, and it's incredibly peaceful, as most battlefields are. There's in conjunction to all that happened there, but You can see up here, Saratoga Springs is north, actually it's in this town of Stillwater, north of Albany. And you have Horatio Gates, who is the American general, and you have Burgoyne, who is the British general, and they have a couple of different battles here, one in September, one in October. But how that ties back to the Battle of Normanskill is that was some Tories who were looking to meet up with Burgoyne. So they were dispersed in Guilderland in August of 1777, and there were a number of battles, one being Oriskany, I think Fort Stanwix, out to the west in central New York. They were also stopping the attempt of the British to split the colonies. So growing up, this gets on all kinds of registers as being one of the 10 most significant battles like ever. So to a kid growing up in the area, it was like, wow, this happened literally up the street. So this is our Revolutionary War thing. Lexington and Concord was secondary to that, but it's a pretty big deal. And there is a statue here, which is fairly interesting. It is a statue to a leg. And this is actually what is this? I did take this picture. This is what's written on the back of the statue. It says, in the memory of the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army, who was desperately wounded on this spot, winning for his countrymen the decisive battle of the American Revolution, and for himself, the rank of Major General. So I'm curious if anybody knows who this is. Because this, you can put it in the chat, this battle, why it's so significant is Benjamin Franklin is over in France, and he's trying to get, European powers to help the United States in this war. And he doesn't really have much to go on because it's not going good for the United States. And these, countries don't want to back a loser. Well, this battle happens at Saratoga. It's a major victory. Basically, Burgoyne surrenders his whole army. I think they were forced to go back to England and promise never to fight on American soil again, which is I guess how things worked back in the 1770s. But basically, when he gets the notice that we've won the Battle of Saratoga, that tips the scales for France backing us. So this is kind of the whole domino effect of why this particular victory becomes so momentous. And yes, somebody says, is Benedict Arnold? The other kind of interesting story about this is only all these quirks you have in history. He makes his big move by rallying the troops in the second battle in October of 1777, sees an opportunity and takes it and basically drives England from the field. The interesting part was he was in his tent because he was disobeying orders, and he was told to sit in his tent because he was having major conflicts with Horatio Gates. So, once again, he becomes a hero by disobeying orders, which, as we'll get to, is not unique for our friend Mr. Arnold. So this are a couple of pictures I took in the fall from the battlefield, and the Hudson River is kind of right over here. There's like a little tributary kind of here. It's an absolutely beautiful place. It's serene. It really is a gorgeous place to visit, and like I said, a very significant location for American history. But since Mr. Arnold is a relatively big figure within the Hudson River, we'll give a quick 4-minute video on the story of Benedict Arnold.
Benedict Arnold is the American version of Judas Iscariot. But to be fair, we have to understand why Arnold betrayed the cause which he ardently supported during the first several years of the American Revolution. George Washington often found himself at odds with the Continental Congress over the system of promotions of his fellow officers. He was hamstrung by Congress because Congress controlled not only the purse strings of the war effort, but also controlled who would be promoted and who would not be promoted. And one of the reasons Benedict Arnold betrayed the country for which he fought so strongly for in the first several years of the war was because of the fact that he was not promoted to a position that he believed he deserved. Without a doubt, Benedict Arnold was George Washington's best, bravest, and most ablest battlefield commander. Arnold was the American hero of the American victory at Saratoga. Arnold, who at that time had been dismissed from command by the commanding officer of the Northern Department of the Continental Army, Horatio Gates, was sulking in his tent when at the most crucial moment of the battle, he heard gunfire erupt in the British redoubt held by Hessians. Arnold leads his men into the rear of the Hessian redoubt, and as he charges through the portal, a bullet smashes into his left leg, shattering his femur. After Arnold sustains his wound at Saratoga, and after he is no longer capable of having a battlefield command, Washington appoints Arnold military governor of Philadelphia. Now, Arnold always wanted to live in the lap of luxury. And as military governor of Philadelphia after the British occupation, Arnold fell in love with an 18-year-old flirtatious, beautiful woman, Peggy Shippen. She was the daughter of a Philadelphia loyalist, and Arnold began colluding with the British in 1779, letting the British know through all kinds of ciphering codes about the dispositions and the strategic implications of the Continental Army. And he was being stoked at this by his wife, Peggy. And when the opportunity arose, Arnold secured from George Washington command of the strategic point on the western bank of the Hudson, West Point, before it was the military academy. One of Peggy's paramours during the British occupation of Philadelphia by the British was Major John Andre, an adjutant of General Henry Clinton, the supreme British commander in North America. And it is with Andre that Arnold colluded to turn over to the British in 1780 the position at West Point. Unfortunately for Arnold, his plans unravel. Andre is captured by 3 Westchester County, New York militiamen. He is stripped, the papers are found on them, the militiamen realize that they've got something here, and the papers are immediately sent to George Washington, who is on his way precipitously to visit West Point at that point in time. When Washington gets to West Point, he realizes something is amiss. The guards aren't posted. The fortifications are a wreck. He's absolutely mystified as to what's going on. The papers are then presented to him, and when he looks at the papers, his face is crestfallen, and he turns to the Marquis de Lafayette and says, "Who can we trust now?" From that moment on, Arnold becomes a man with a price on his head. Washington orders Andre to be executed at this spot where we are in Tappan, New York, and puts a general standing order. Should Arnold be captured on the field of battle, he is to be summarily executed. Arnold will die in 1801 at the age of 60, a spiritually, financially, and emotionally broken man.
Okay, so that's the uplifting story of Benedict Arnold, and yeah, I see in the chat there was a book that was based on the Peggy Shippen story. This actually was interesting. I was at a webinar a couple of weeks ago. There was some historians who were had released a film trying to resurrect Arnold's reputation, which is kind of a strange topic. It was one of the more surreal webinars I've ever been on, is trying to basically kind of explain that, well, he was a traitor, but he did a lot of good stuff. That I will say that Ticonderoga I mentioned, which is where the cannons were brought to Dorchester Heights to get the British out of Boston Harbor. I believe it was Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen who actually captured Ticonderoga. And then Henry Knox said in the winter of 1775-76, took those cannons all the way across from upstate New York into Boston in a brutal winter. But we'll move on to my hometown of Albany. This is taken in 2020. It's the Erastus Corning Tower. It is the capital of New York. So we'll do a quick video here that will go through some of the history, and then we'll get to some of the specifics of Capitol Land.
Our first stop today is in Albany, the capital city. But the roots of this town are so old, they predate the founding of America by 110 years. Albany is one of the oldest surviving European settlements from the original 13 colonies. The Dongan Charter established Albany as a city in 1686, and it is the oldest U.S. city charter still in effect. So, by American standards, this city is as old as the hills. The land was first inhabited by the Mohican and Algonquin tribes. The Mohicans called it, here goes, Pempotowethut Mohicanu, meaning fireplace of the Mohican nation. Englishman Henry Hudson of Hudson River fame settled the region for the Dutch in 1609. Due to the rich fur beaver trade, the Dutch called the area Beverwyck, and that name was so terrible that when the English took over a few decades later, they changed it to Albany. But it is the Dutch heritage that has lasted to this day.
Hi, I'm Michelle Vennard, President of the Albany Convention and Visitors Bureau in historic Albany, New York. We have this really short history of the Dutch being the folks who founded Albany, only about 40 years before the English took over. But we still celebrate and we still have those Dutch roots that are very, very important to us here.
When we travel around the region today, there's still a lot of Dutch place names and other remnants of that Dutch culture.
To find Albany, just follow Henry Hudson's river north.
Albany is about 2.5 hours north of New York City and about the same distance south of Montreal, so right in the crossroads of a lot of different things.
You're probably wondering, how the heck is the capital of New York Albany? After all, New York City would become the capital of the whole country in 1789. There's a not-so-funny story to that.
Albany became the capital of New York, quite frankly, because the British kept chasing our soldiers from the Revolutionary War up the river.
The Redcoats. NYC was captured in 1776, so the Continental Army retreated. Albany wasn't even New York State's first choice. It was originally Kingston, but during the Revolutionary War, the British burned it to the ground after the Battle of Saratoga.
During the Revolutionary War, the British controlled New York City. It was a loyalist stronghold. So they kept going farther up the river to places like Kingston and Poughkeepsie. Sometimes they were not there for very long. And then they finally ended up in Albany. So in 1797, this became the official capital.
Today's Albany is as modern as ever. Its blue-collar past has turned into a high-tech future.
The vibe of Albany is a great combination of kind of old and new. People who are retiring and downsizing, and the millennials who want to live in the downtown area. So we're getting that great mix.
It has such a great history, beautiful neighborhoods, the surrounding area, there's so much to see and do. And you can easily be in a city environment or you can be in the country.
The farming communities upstate have contributed to the capital's budding gastronomical uprising.
Albany is also part of a great fork-to-table or farm-to-table revolution that's going on now.
The farm goods that are produced around here, you can taste in the restaurants, you can buy yourself at some of the farmers markets. And I think, you get a sense that you can actually taste a little bit of the valley as well as see it.
Albany is part of a group of cities known as the Capital Region, which encompasses our next little upstate charmer with a monumental past. Let's hit the spas and visit the effervescent town of Saratoga Springs.
We are in the Vale of Springs, and right behind me is the Island Spouter. Hi, my name is Allie Schweizer, and I'm the environmental educator here at Saratoga Spa State Park. Saratoga Springs is just below the Adirondacks, about 40 miles north of Albany.
The springs in Saratoga Springs refers to mineral-rich waters bubbling all around the area.
When we had an earthquake here a long, long time ago, the shell kind of cracked open. It's kind of like a bottle that gets shaken and then explodes. Same thing is going on here. There's a bunch of carbon dioxide pushing the waters out of the earth.
The idea of the healing waters of the springs attracted businessmen to build giant spa hotels in the area, attracting thousands of affluent customers.
Up here, the Gideon Putnam Hotel is where people would stay for 3 weeks at a time. And they'd take a bath a day, and they'd also be prescribed mineral water depending on their ailment.
The mound you're seeing is called tufa, a type of limestone that occurs from carbon-rich waters.
There's all those minerals, it runs through the limestone, it picks up all the minerals, and then when it releases the gas, it becomes less acidic, and all those minerals precipitate out, basically like a giant Tums.
So after you take a peek at the world's biggest antacid at Saratoga Spa State Park, you'll want to stroll through town and get the vibe of this historic and upscale town.
I love Saratoga because of the history here and up and down the valleys. You can study the American Revolutionary War very, very easily.
Visit the shops. I mean, it's a great walking city by all means. You can get a lot done in a few hours of walking in Saratoga Springs. It's vibrant, it's a dynamic small city, and it's a year-round destination.
Summer especially is a crazy time. You have a symphony and a ballet and rock concerts and fireworks and the racing going on.
The area is very close to the Adirondacks, the Berkshires, whole lots of recreational possibilities. And it is, as you can see, damned pretty.
So I will say that I did have the privilege / curse of working at Saratoga Racetrack for a couple of years when I was in college, and Saratoga was actually the neatest place. And I'll get to this just in a second. Growing up in Albany in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't the most dynamic place, but Saratoga was really unique, particularly in the summer, and that became a huge drawing card for us. And they actually built WPA, Work Progress Administration, built a lot of the baths in Saratoga. And I've never done it, but you can actually still, I think it's relatively cheap, sit in one of the baths that have the waters. I will say the waters do have a lot of sulfur in them and smell like rotten eggs, which was something hard to get over. But like I said, it was originally called Fort Orange / Beverwyck, Orange being the noble family name of Holland and Beverwyck being the beaver. The state capitol, which you saw a picture of, at the time was the most expensive government building ever built. It took 32 years to construct. 3 teams of architects, one of which included H.H. Richardson, the famous architect who's responsible for Trinity Church down in Copley Square. And I've never actually set foot in it. The one time I was supposed to go on a field trip, I was sick. And I went back there in 2020 and it was closed for COVID. So certainly on my bucket list is to get myself into that place. One of the famous things is the $1 Million Staircase, which is the main staircase inside the Capitol. And Albany had the, dubious honor of having one of the longest serving mayors, Mayor Orestes Corning II, who was mayor for 41 years, from 1942 to 1983. And he was the pawn in one of the last political machines that you saw in the United States. So it was not the most dynamic place, certainly when I was growing up. And the machine boss was a guy named Dan O'Connell. And the interesting connection is Polly Noonan was this kind of behind the scenes puppet master, and she had this complicated relationship with Corning. And it turns out, and I just found this out a couple of years ago, that the current senator, one of the current senators from New York, is Kirsten Gillibrand, and her grandmother is Polly Noonan, who was very, very integral in this political machine. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this thing that doesn't get talked a lot about, and I never heard it in Albany, but it's the Albany Plan of Union, which was a meeting in 1754 at the old Albany City Hall, which is no longer there. Actually, the new City Hall, new, quote unquote, new, was from the late 1800s, and that was also designed by H.H. Richardson. But this was the meeting that I mentioned before when Benjamin Franklin actually created this graphic, this join or die, which you see a lot now, and you kind of associate with the Revolution, but it actually was for this meeting of the colonies, really with this French and Indian War, trying to unite the colonies against the French and the Indians. And you can see that this is New England, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, I'm not sure what that is, Maryland, these various colonies going down to South Carolina. I guess Georgia wasn't there yet. And so he was trying to get this whole concept of unity together. So this is obviously 22 years or so, 21 years before the Declaration of Independence. But, these ideas are brewing, and Albany was a major place where this particular meeting happened. And I said, growing up there, we never heard about this. So it's pretty interesting. But back to the Capitol, that's a picture I took at night of the Capitol, which that is Philip Sheridan, who was a native of Albany, another problematic figure who was a Civil War hero, but also became very prevalent in the Indian Wars after the war. So he's got, I'm not surprised, I wouldn't be surprised if that statue comes down at some point. But also, this is the Empire State Plaza, which was built during my time. If you know a native if they call it the South Mall, because Nelson Rockefeller, and we'll get to the Rockefellers later, he was the governor for 4 terms in the 60s, and I think he ended in the early 70s. And the story went that he was giving a tour of the Queen of the Netherlands, once again, with it being a Dutch heritage. She came for a tour of Albany, and he was so horrified by the decrepit state of the area here that he wanted to just basically level it and build this plaza, which Rocky being Rocky, he did. And so I actually graduated high school underneath here as a convention center. So this is called the Egg, which is a performing arts center. This is the Capitol, like I said, which is there before. And these are state office buildings. And I'm standing on the steps of the New York State Museum into this big plaza. The problem with this is it does rise above the city of Albany. So it doesn't really integrate. It's one of these, if you've ever seen the old architecture critic for the Globe talk, it's kind of like City Hall Plaza in Boston. It's one of these architectural nightmares that was done in the 60s that really doesn't work that well as far as getting people to gather and just as a regular, transition within a city. It's a very aloof thing by itself. That being said, it did give Albany a skyline, so for whatever that's worth. But back to the political machines. The most famous author, the Bard of Albany, is William Kennedy, who most people probably know from the book Ironweed, which won the Pulitzer Prize in '82 or '83, which was kind of a momentous thing for Albany, because not only was it a local Sun winning the Pulitzer Prize, but it was for a book about Albany. And so he wrote the Albany trilogy, and this became a major motion picture with Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson, directed by, I forget who it was directed by, but I think his book, he's kind of he's a literary author. He uses magical realism. Some of his books, I think, can be fairly difficult, but he always kind of wrote around the Albany. He was a newspaper reporter for the Albany Times-Union for years, so he knew how things worked, and he kind of danced around it in a lot of his books. But he finally wrote a book, I think it was in the '90s, called Roscoe, which really goes into a fictional account of the whole Albany Democratic machine and how it works and how they got out the votes and all the graft and everything else. And so, if I was to suggest a book from William Kennedy to read, and I do suggest, he's a very, very good author, still alive. He's about 93. I used to enjoy when he would come out for a book reading, and I would go to his book readings and have a little chat. He started a writers in residence program at SUNY Albany, where I went to school, and has had famous writers there for years. Got to actually see and meet Kurt Vonnegut there. So if you're looking for an interesting read on the political politics and the political machine, Roscoe is a great one to check out. So moving along, we'll go into transportation in the early 1800s, which is pretty seminal as to how the country evolves. And you have the Robert Fulton steamboat, which comes out of New York, originally called the North River Steamboat. Like I said, the Hudson was called the North River up until later in the 1800s. And the boat, as we know, the Claremont, goes up the Hudson from New York City to Albany in a little over a day at about 4.7 miles an hour. But a sailing ship would take 4 days. So once again, you're, cutting it by, 300%. And so interestingly, Fulton is on the commission that, surprise, surprise, recommends building the Erie Canal, which will also help shipping. And so the Erie Canal becomes this kind of foundational engineering project for the early United States, because this is like the 1820s, I believe. And we'll watch a video on this, but it's pretty fascinating that, this canal is going from basically the Great Lakes, is Lake Erie down here. You have Niagara Falls over here. And it's going by north of Buffalo and goes out into the Hudson River north of Albany. And so what it does is it opens up, this goes down obviously to New York City. So it opens up the Midwestern part of the nation to trade and be able to ship the goods through water. So at this point, the railroad is not really an entity yet. And this is why the Erie Canal is actually relatively short-lived as a major trading thoroughfare, because the railroads come along and for the most part make it semi-obsolete. But it is pretty fascinating story, and it is one of those great engineering projects that had a huge, huge impact as to how the United States grows commercially.
Even though the Erie Canal quite literally helped shape this nation, this is what so many people think of first when the canal comes up in conversation.
I've got an old mule and her name is Sal. 15 years on the Erie Canal.
But except for the fact that mules did indeed drag boats along the Erie Canal, from Albany
to Buffalo.
Even singer and historian Dave Ruck will tell you the song actually has very little to do with it.
Is there any evidence that it was ever actually sung on the Erie Canal, except for situations like this?
Turns out it's a 20th century song. It's actually written by a professional songwriter who was from, of all places, Massachusetts. So this man, Thomas S. Allen, he comes to Rochester, New York around 1910, sees the canal for the first time, hears the phrase low bridge, everybody down, low. And he ends up composing the song. It's the only canal song he wrote.
So he wasn't a canalman?
Not only was he not a canalman, but no one ever sang the song on at least on the 19th century canal.
The canal, which turned 200 years old last Tuesday, was championed by a man who was as stubborn as a mule. DeWitt Clinton, mayor of New York City, who became governor of the state. He spent 10 years fighting to sell this project to a deeply skeptical public.
It was hard. It was not an easy sell. These landowners that are listed.
Brad Utter is an historian at the New York State Museum. Presidents Jefferson and Madison refused to help fund the canal, so Clinton had to raise the $7 million needed to build it. Some people thought it was a great idea, but
not with my money. You're a little crazy because you're trying to go through swamps and virgin forest, and there's no labor, there's no machinery to do that kind of thing. This is all new.
It was a gargantuan undertaking for a nation just 41 years old. The canal would be dug by hand, every inch of it, for 363 miles. It would be 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. 83 locks would have to be built. But Clinton kept at it, financed the project with some state money and by selling bonds, and construction began July 4th, 1817. It was completed in just 8 years.
On time, in advance, and under budget.
Really?
Yes.
If only.
Yeah.
If only we could do that.
It's many miles to Buffalo, oh, that low bridge.
A trip that could have taken 6 weeks before the canal now took less than 1 week and cost 1/10 of an overland trip. So as soon as it opened, the canal was overwhelmed with traffic, and it paid for itself with tolls in just 10 years.
Over 100 years old.
John McKee operates the locks in Lockport, New York.
Sometimes there was a day or two wait just to get through the locks. Boats would be packed up on both sides of the banks right here. And of course, while they were lined up waiting to go through, they would spend their time and money in town here, and that added to the population here in Lockport.
Population grew in towns all along the canal. Rochester, New York Mayor Lovely Warren traces the beginnings of her city to the canal.
The Erie Canal was the foundation of Rochester. It was the foundation of our industry, and we were a flour mill city, and that's the way that Rochester first started to build itself up. Population started to grow once the Erie Canal came into fruition.
But the canal also accelerated the western expansion of the nation. People and commerce were able to reach and develop what would become the American Midwest. A region that was isolated and landlocked was now connected via the canal and the Hudson River down to New York City and the world.
Within a year or two, there were already calls of, hey, let's make it bigger.
And they did. By 1862, the canal was almost twice as wide and twice as deep. People and goods and ideas flowed 24 hours a day in both directions.
The impact that the internet has had on our culture and our society is very similar to the impact that the canal had. Sharing ideas, making things faster.
The canal was used to bring slaves to freedom. And
Part of the Underground Railroad.
Part of the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass would bring slaves here and actually lead them to freedom.
The first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, a canal town. And Joseph Smith started the Mormon religion in Palmyra, along the shores of the canal. But the progress and prosperity was not shared by all. The canal was dug right through traditional Native American land, displacing many who lived there to make way for the commerce that grew steadily for decades until the next great advance, railroads.
The Iron Horse was there. The railroad was there to compete. And the canal was more efficient. You could pull more with less energy and it's cheaper, but the railroad was fast.
The railroad took passenger traffic first, leaving the canal boats to haul mostly freight. But by the 1950s, most of the freight traffic was gone too.
Let the boats pass the next one.
Today, most of the boats John McKee puts through the locks are pleasure craft. The gates are opened by motors that are a century old. McKee and most everyone who works on the canal system feels the history of what in its early days was derided as Clinton's ditch. Josh Pagan keeps digging today to keep the canal deep enough.
I realized that I worked at a museum that stretched from the Hudson River to the Niagara River in Buffalo and connected us to Lake Ontario.
The value of the canal cannot be measured anymore in tons of freight or numbers of passengers that it moves. But it is hard not to be moved by the canal itself and the achievement 2 centuries ago of just getting it dug.
What it represents, I think, is American ingenuity and American spirit. And so the fact that we still have this canal here today, I think it should be celebrated as long as we can keep it here.
Okay, so obviously the Erie Canal is kind of a microcosm of the commercial evolution of the United States. Actually, let me go back a couple of slides and it shows this. It doesn't really, but the St. Lawrence Seaway, which opened up in the 50s, I believe, this kind of goes out toward Montreal and out to the North Atlantic. That pretty much has superseded the shipping. So you can go right here, portage across and go up and out here. And there's pretty fascinating locks there. The Eisenhower Lock is a pretty interesting thing that my dad dragged us to. So moving on to the artistic part of the valley. Rich, and once again, a lot of the early American stuff is happening in this part of the country. So you have pretty much was the first kind of, I guess, celebrity American writer is Washington Irving. So he's famous, obviously, for Rip Van Winkle, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and his home is still there, and you can go visit it in Tarrytown, which is a southern part of the valley called Sunnyside. James Fenimore Cooper, famous for the Leather Stocking Tales, The Deer Slayer, Last of the Mohicans, The Spy, one of the first spy novels. His father actually founded Cooperstown, another beautiful place, not really in the Hudson Valley per se, but west of the Hudson Valley, and home to the Hall of Fame, where a Big Papi will be inducted next month. And the painters, which we'll get into, the Hudson River School. Thomas Cole is considered the originator of the Hudson River School. He's actually English, but ends up migrating to America, takes on his most famous pupil, who is Frederick Church, probably the most well-known of the Hudson River Valley, Hudson River School painters. Albert Bierstadt is also considered Hudson River School. He was actually German, but based out of New York, and his paintings are associated with kind of promoting the American West. And he's very famous for a large painting of Yosemite. So there is kind of a tie between the Hudson River School and transcendentalism. So you have these things that are happening in the middle of the 18th century with Emerson and Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, and this going on. And then you have what's happening in the Hudson River School. And so this is kind of a quick video that ties those two concepts together.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now this will just be a quick lecture on the emergence and proliferation of a distinctly American artistic culture that emerged during the first half of the 19th century. Now prior to this, Americans had never really settled down long enough to create a unique artistic and literary sensibility because, we were too busy settling the West and violating all of those Indian treaties that we had made because, that took a lot of work.
It's time to kick it old school.
So it was during the first half of the 19th century that American writers, artists, architects, and historians really began to come into their own and create uniquely American art. And you should know that the intellectual climate of the time was suffused with an idea called Romanticism. And this way of understanding the world emphasized imagination over reason, nature over civilization, and gut feelings over rational calculation. Romantics wanted to poke around in their guts and find what was there and then spill it out onto canvases and paper. So let's talk about the writers first. During this period, you've got Washington Irving, who became famous for his story Rip Van Winkle, that tale of the hapless man harassed by his wife, who inadvertently slept through the entire American Revolution and woke up afterwards to a completely changed society. And let's not forget James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote the best-selling Last of the Mohicans. But maybe most notable during this period was the rise of what was called the Transcendentalist writers. They called themselves Transcendentalists because they thought that knowing truth was more than just a matter of taking the world in via the senses. They thought that truth transcended the mind, and therefore you must use more than your brain folds to discover it. The most famous of these guys was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who argued through his writings for self-reliance, self-confidence, self-improvement, optimism, and freedom. A close associate of Emerson's was Henry David Thoreau, who took these principles in hand and moved to a little shack by a pond for 2 years and lived as simply as he could and wrote his reflections in the book Walden. And it was Thoreau's book that epitomized the transcendentalist longing to escape civilization and live under the principles of self-reliance. Oh, and you've also got that magnificent American poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote one of my favorite poems, The Cross of Snow. And you must indulge me as I read to you this poem. And this poem will make more sense to you if you understand that he wrote it about his wife who died because her clothes caught fire in their house and she burned to death. In the long, sleepless watches of the night, a gentle face, the face of one long dead, looks at me from the wall, where round its head the night lamp casts a halo of pale light. Here in this room she died, and soul more white never through martyrdom of fire was led to its repose, nor can in books be read the legend of a life more benedight. There is a mountain in the distant west that, sun-defying in its deep ravines, displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my breast, these 18 years, through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died. Ah, magnificent. Okay, those were the writers, but I must quickly add that there was a new form of portraiture and painting that arose during this time too. Probably the best known group of artists during this time was a group known as the Hudson River School, who, obeying their romantic impulses for nature, cast their eyes upon the rugged beauty of the American landscape and began to paint it. Here's a painting called The Oxbow by Thomas Cole, and as you look at it, you can almost feel the anxiety over the increasing industrialization of the land. Now, I mention all of this because it's very easy to talk about legislation and wars and politics and forget that even though our nation was crammed tight with pragmatics, it also had a beating heart, which looked at the American landscape, which looked at the American heart and said that what we had within us, what we had in front of us, was beautiful in our sight, and we ought to stop for a moment and see it. I'll see you next time.
So, Frederick Church, his house is called Olana, and it's on Hudson, New York. It is on the Hudson River. I was there on Memorial Day, a week and a half ago. It's a fascinating place. I mean, it's this Islamic architecture, which he was this intrepid world traveler. He literally went everywhere. He was in the Arctic. He was in the Andes. He had a very strong affinity, obviously, for the Middle East. So incredibly fascinating place and incredibly fascinating guy. And this is a very, very well preserved house in the Upper Valley. And you can see, some of the details here is you have an Islamic arch overlooking, this is a view of the Hudson River. I guess he did plant trees, like you see there's a lot of these estates along the Hudson. They plant these trees, obviously, 100 years later, they're a lot taller and they're blocking some of the view. But this is the view actually from the second floor from his daughter's bedroom. Same thing, overlooking the Hudson, just a fascinating place. And like I mentioned, he was a student of Thomas Cole. So this is actually a view from the porch on the house overlooking the Hudson. And this is the Rip Van Winkle Bridge, which goes, and over in here is actually where Thomas Cole's house is. And they have a thing called the Hudson River Skywalk, which we didn't get a chance to do. We were kind of pinched for time and had to go to Alana, and then we're going down to Storm King, which we'll get to in a second. But they had this river walk, which you go over the Rip Van Winkle Bridge over the Hudson, and then you can visit Thomas Cole's house. Now, Thomas Cole's house is not nearly as ornate as Frederick Church. He died young. I think he got diphtheria or some sort of disease, but he died in his late 30s, early 40s. So he did not become as successful as Church, and Church was an incredibly successful painter in his lifetime. So he is not a Vincent van Gogh story. He definitely was able to enjoy a lot of the fruits of his work. But he did move here after Cole had passed away, and so you have a nice connection here between the two spaces. And so this is definitely something I want to get back to when I go back to the valley. This is one of his most famous paintings, obviously Niagara Falls. And this is in the National Gallery down in Washington, D.C. It used to be in a museum called the Corcoran, which actually went belly up and is now part of George Washington University. And they deaccessioned their collection, and it went to the National Gallery of Art. And this is something that, I saw, and when I was doing some reading on Church, if you notice this painting, what's kind of interesting about it, and if you've been to Niagara Falls, this is the horseshoe, the Canadian side, it's amazing how close you get. And so what Church does here is there's no shore. You're right here with the Niagara River going over. And I went there as a kid, and I had this picture somewhere from an Instamatic camera of literally like hanging over the side here. You could walk right up to, there's a little bit of a wall right here. It was like 3 feet tall or something. You can like look over the falls. So it's really fascinating how he puts you right into the, the power of Niagara, and there's, no shore, nothing really kind of to stabilize you. Oops. So my homage to Mr. Church is taken, actually we go back, this over here is actually Goat Island right here. And this is the island within the Niagara River that makes the two falls. The American Falls is over here, there's Bridal Falls, and then you have the Horseshoe Falls, which is the Canadian side. So my little travel tip is, if you go to Niagara Falls, do not spend very much time on the United States side. It is very tacky and very disgusting. However, Goat Island is a state park on the US side, and it's fabulous because you're in the middle of basically where the Niagara River splits. And so my homage to Mr. Church was, I plopped, cut out the shore, put you right here. I had somebody ask me, I think they were joking, but I'm not sure they were. They asked me if I took it from a boat. Obviously, if I was taken from a boat, that would be the last picture I took because I go over the falls. But it is fascinating, and you can see how there's, you can get a lot from different mediums of art, and work it into your practice. So the final historical part is the mansions in the Gilded Age. So Niagara, Hudson is, probably second to Newport in our area as far as the proliferation of mansions. Famous quote from William Henry Vanderbilt, notice the Dutch name, "The public be damned, I am working for my stockholders." So you have these people who, obviously New York is the, the commercial capital of the country, and you have all these industries, railroads, steel, oil, finance. So they're looking for respites from the New York summers. And as the video in the Erie Canal mentioned, the first thing that railroads do is take passengers. So you have relatively easy access north of New York City up along the Hudson to enjoy some space in the country. And as a result, a lot of these titans built mansions, and a lot of them are still there. This is a titan, actually. Interesting guy, Samuel F.B. Morse, who was famous as for Morse code, but he's famous and infamous for other stuff. He's actually was a very, very well-respected portrait painter. And there's a book by, I mentioned it here, David McCulloch, Greater Journey, and he spends a lot of time in Paris as a painter. He built this house on the Hudson in the 1850s. Great grounds. If you go there, there's great hiking as you go down from here, actually from this side, going down to the river, and you get some great views on the river. But he was a problematic character. He was very anti-immigrant, very anti-Catholic, very pro-slavery. He was a member of the Nativist Party and actually ran for mayor of New York, only receiving 1,500 votes. But, once again, the story, you don't hear a lot about F.B. Morse. People just associate him with the telegraph and Morse code, but he was a very complex figure, and his estate is open to the public around Hyde Park and Poughkeepsie, Hyde Park in the middle of the Hudson. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his birthplace, home, and grave are in Hyde Park. The house is known as Springwood, open to the public. We'll get to Eleanor's part next, but this was originally owned by others. It came into his family it was a shingled cottage, but in the early 1900s it gets remodeled, and FDR's mother famously lives with them until her death in 1941, which created a lot of conflict with Eleanor. And the same deal as you saw in Frederick Church's, trees were planted by FDR down towards the river, and now, 80 to 100 years later, they block the view, which is kind of frustrating. And this is a statue they have on the site. His grave is here. Once again, infrared. That's Eleanor. And she had a separate cottage. These actually are not my pictures, but I couldn't find the ones I took. But there's a little estate up the road on the right-hand side, not on the river, not on the riverside. It's called Valkill, and this was kind of her separate cottage and her respite. This is, once again, this is, kind of quintessential Eleanor. It's, very, very homey, very down to earth. This is actually the room where she received JFK when he was trying to get her endorsement when he was running for president in 1960. She actually used this as trying to give some work to the farmers, and there was actually a furniture making operation that was here and run during the winter to try to give employment for the seasonal workers. And this is kind of one of your classic, just big money Ogden Mills Stottsburg, which was built by the famous, or designed and built by the famous architectural firm of McKim, Mead and White. Once again, has a Newport Mansion kind of look, goes down to the river, beautiful views into the river. There's not dozens, but there's certainly a lot of these along the river, and they're state parks for the most part. This is the Vanderbilts. These are not my photos, but it was under construction. We were there about 4 or 5 years ago. But it wouldn't be a respite for the robber barons if there wasn't a Vanderbilt mansion. So it's not on par with Breakers. It's kind of tough to beat Breakers, and certainly not the size of Biltmore. But it is a great location along the Hudson River, and the renovations have been complete, and it's open to the public again. And so if you want to get your 20-foot ceiling fill and gold filigree and all that, that's a spot for you. This is kind of the gem of it, is Rockefeller's Kijket, which is a Dutch word meaning high view. It was finished by J.D. Rockefeller Sr. in 1913. He was a Baptist, and so he was, quote unquote, less ostentatious. So as far as mansions go, it's relatively understated. It has passed through the family, and it was a big deal. As I said, I mentioned Nelson Rockefeller, so he's the grandson of J.D. Rockefeller Sr., and he's the governor of New York for 4 terms, becomes the vice president under Ford. And he is a great collector of modern art. Actually, his mother, Abby, is one of the founders of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And so this was, once he passed away in 1979, it was kind of ambiguous for a while, and it did not open to the public until 1994. And so when it opens in 94, it's actually quite a big deal. And to get tickets was a long wait. One of the big things was Nelson Rockefeller had a modern art gallery in the basement, and that is in the house. So that was, a huge access to that. So it's not quite as hard to get tickets now as it was. I was there 3 years ago. Fascinating to get there. You do have to get tickets in advance, and I think they're trying to open up more of their property. There's a large separate house, is like it was a playhouse for the children, but it's the size of any large house we have around here, and they're gradually refurbishing that. But it is a fascinating mansion to take a look at, and this is taken from the front portico, And this is from the side overlooking. This is once again the view of the Hudson River. So you have these pesky trees, but you still get the vista of the Hudson and the Catskills in the distance. This is fairly far south in the Hudson River Valley. It's when we were waiting for the bus to take the tour, I checked my map. I think I was like 20 miles from Times Square, so very, very south of the Hudson River Valley. Other mansions are open to the public. This is a drone shot, not mine, but it's Lyndhurst, Jay Gould's in Tarrytown, pretty far south. As I mentioned, there's a Sunnyside, Washington Irving's house from the early 1800s, and Wilderstein, which I believe is actually a wooden kind of Victorian structure of Margaret, was owned by Margaret Stuckley, who was a cousin of FDR, and that's further north in Rhinebeck, New York. So that takes us kind of the history, and I want to quickly go through kind of the current day and quick Google Maps here, just to show folks it really isn't that, 3 hours and 15 minutes, 3 hours and 20 minutes. I would suggest going this route actually. I have become a very, very trying to avoid 84 in Connecticut, not one of my favorite roads, but not that far to get into the Hudson River Valley. Right here is north of the valley. You kind of come in here around Hudson and Frederick Church's Olana is really right up here. So Olana is really only about 3 hours from Chelmsford. So it's a fairly easy drive on major highways. And this kind of maps out. So like I said, up north here, you have Olana, which here is in Hudson. You have the Rhinebeck Aerodrome, which is kind of a fascinating recreation of World War I flying. You have Woodstock over here and Bethel Woods, which is where the 1969 concert, they have actually got, I haven't been to it yet, but there's a brand new museum out there, which is supposed to be quite nice. Here's Hyde Park and the Roosevelt Home and the Vanderbilts. You have Poughkeepsie kind of in the middle. Going down, you get into West Point, which we'll get to in a second. You kind of have Storm King's Sculpture Park. And then as you go down toward the city, you get more into Tarrytown and a lot of the mansions. The mansion's just amazing. Like I said, the Kikett Mansion really is about 30 miles north of Times Square. But one of the favorite things is the Culinary Institute of America, the CIA, is in Hyde Park, New York, which is just north of Poughkeepsie, where the FDR house is. And it's a pretty fascinating place. They are open to the public. They have multiple restaurants. It was the first college to teach culinary arts in the US, opened in 1946. I was there last Thursday. And you can see they claim they were the original CIA, since the Central Intelligence Agency was not founded until 1947. They were founded in 1946. But all the students, one of the concepts they have here is they want the students, no matter what your major study is, they want you to have experience at all different jobs. So people who are your waiters are students, and they're not necessarily in the hospitality side of the business. They may be actually chefs, but they want to cycle them through all the different functions you have in the, of course, a restaurant business. And American Bounty is a restaurant I've eaten at. Bocuse is the French restaurant. And there's a Ristorante Caterina de Medici is the Italian restaurant. They have since opened up a brewery there as well. So it's a pretty cool place. This is the Italian villa that they have there with the tile roofs. And this is one of the kitchens. You can take courses there, one-day courses and things along those lines. The food is amazing. These are actually my pictures. I will say that these are iPhone pictures. Portrait mode is your friend. So these are without a doubt the best dinner rolls I have ever had. And they're very, very nice, where they will give you a complimentary order of dinner rolls to take with you home if you ask them. So pretty neat place. Strongly recommend. I would recommend reservations. Although we were there, we were talking to the maitre d', and he said they've actually been fairly slow. But as we found out with Benedict Arnold, West Point is on the river further south. The military academy was established in 1802. About 4,000 cadets currently attend. One of my quick interactive questions is 3 presidents have graduated from West Point. Can you name them? And I will say it's a bit of a trick question. So you want to pop that in the chat if you have any thoughts as to what the presidents are who graduated from West Point. But it is an active military installation. So I was there in 2019, so I was there before the pandemic. But the tours even then were very rigid. And the tour guide kept reinforcing that we're on an active military installation, so you can't wander off from the tours. We had a large number of Chinese tourists on the bus who did not speak English except for one, and they kept rambling off, and it was I said it was in September, so she had obviously spent a whole summer of trying to corral tourists, and it was, from my perspective, relatively amusing. I'm sure from her perspective it was not, but it is an active military installation, so you really can't wander off, and you have to go in by bus, and you have to have reservations and all that. Nobody's taken a shot at who the presidents are, but the three presidents were U.S. Grant, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, went to graduate from West Point. These are a couple of pictures. This is the cover photo I used at the beginning of the presentation, the ship going up the Hudson here. It gets pretty wide as you go further south here, and you can see the hills go right down to the water, so it's pretty dramatic. When I was there, this is actually a picture I took. This cadet, just like, I don't know, with the tour, they like send out a cadet so you can get like pictures of cadets. But there's this one cadet who would just, he stood up over here at one point, and he sat down for a bit on this bench and then walked off. It was like something out of central casting, but they didn't tell us that it was part of the tour, but it was kind of interesting. And as we saw in the video with Benedict Arnold, West Point was a very strategic part for the continent, United States, and they actually had a chain that was across the river. The technology in 1770 or 1780, that was what you did. So to stop any ships going north, they had this chain dragged across the relatively wide Hudson River, and they had this park here which has some links from that chain, which is pretty interesting. When you stand next to them, I mean, these are just Jagunda, and obviously they're steel, iron. It's just unbelievable how large they are. You can see kind of scale wise with the cannon here, but they are very big, and these were, I guess, actual links that were used to fortify the river. And Storm King Art Center is, we'll have to skip the video here as we're getting a little bit late here, but this is a sculpture park that's on the west side of the river, down, I don't know, about 45 minutes south of Hyde Park. Probably one of the, certainly in the northern part of the United States, the most preeminent sculpture park. These are huge sculptures. You can see the scale with the people down here, and they have these large sculptures, and they go off across this land. This was taken in the spring. It's infrared. This is not snow. But it's just an amazing space, and it's large. They do have a tram that goes around if you don't feel like walking it. We were there on Memorial Day. It was 95 degrees. So unfortunately, the tram was about to stop running because I had to get from Ohana down to Storm King, and we got in just before it closed at 4:15. So we had about an hour and 15 minutes in the park. These were taken at a previous trip in 2017. And these are the pictures I took last week, and this is the picture that's my virtual background behind me. Just an amazing place, and they have all different kinds of sculptures, very famous. This is Andy Goldsworthy, who has works around here. He has some up at Alnoba in New Hampshire. He has one over at the DeCordova in Lincoln. It's kind of interesting sculpture, but it's a large space. I forget how many acres it is, but it's definitely something worth checking out because it's unique. $23 for a carload, so put your friends in the trunk and get as many people as you want into it. Really neat, really neat. There isn't a lot around it, so it is kind of out of the way. It's on the west side of the river, which is a little more, there's more stuff on the east side of the river, and down that section, as you see, most of the mansions and everything are on the east side of the river, but it's worth a trip, a very interesting place. And quickly on the river, there are cruises you can take on the river, from Kingston to Beacon, which is a little further south, up in Albany, up in Hudson, Newburgh. We took the one out of Kingston, the Hudson River Cruises, cleverly named. Go about an hour. There are lighthouses on the river. And you can see it goes a little bit, it's Kingston's north, so it doesn't get quite to the Vanderbilt mansion, but it's pretty neat. And, you can cruise along the river, and it's obviously very mellow. And we were there on a beautiful day, and there were some nice lighthouses to take in, and it's a nice experience. A whole mess of other stuff. I mentioned the Rhinebeck Aerodrome. There's this walkway over the Hudson in Poughkeepsie, which is a decommissioned railroad bridge, which I'm kind of have a complicated relationship with heights. Wasn't my favorite thing in the world. I couldn't find any pictures from it, maybe because every picture I took was not in focus because my hands were shaking. But It's pretty neat. It's this huge railroad bridge that's been converted totally to a pedestrian walkway and goes across the Hudson in Poughkeepsie. Tons of wineries. They've been there for a long time. A lot of people from New York City who were retired and wanted to get into the wine industry. This goes back to probably the 80s or 90s, moved up north. And for a long time, the Hudson River Valley has been noted for its wines. More recently, beer as well. There's a nice garden, the Innisfree Garden. Lots of art. So there's Opus 40, which is kind of a neat sculpture near the hometown of Jimmy Fallon in Saugerties. As I mentioned, the Bethel's Wood Center for the Arts, which is Woodstock. I said that's a bit of a hoof. It's 75 miles west of Poughkeepsie. I would suggest you do that and then head out to Cooperstown. And then there's Beacon, New York, which was featured on Chronicle a couple of years ago. They had a Chronicle episode where they said, guess where we are? And it was a bit of a trick because they were in Beacon, New York, since Chronicle typically focuses on New England. But that's a neat place. And there's, I think there's an art installation there as well. So we've pretty much covered the top 15 things. This is the source of, as I mentioned earlier on, most of these books I got from the library consortium that we have through Chelmsford in the Merrimack Valley. Not really a shortage of information on the Hudson River Valley, although specific things about the Hudson River Valley, all I could come up with was this 2-volume history, which was written relatively recently. And I did buy one of them, and I got another one from the library, but it gives a obviously very voluminous description of what's been going on in the Hudson River Valley since its inception, and obviously tying into New York City, the Iroquois, and then a novel. T.C. Boyle, the author, famous for The Road to Wellville and other things, he wrote a novel called World's End, which is one of these novels that takes place in the Hudson River Valley through 2 different time frames, one during the actual patroon time and one more recent, kind of magic realism. Interesting story, and I would highly recommend that. It really gives you a flavor of kind of the complexity of the valley and all the different characters that are involved in that. So that is pretty much it. I said I'm on social media, Instagram, post pictures, a lot of them from the Hudson River Valley recently. And I'm going to be, since I am a photographer, I actually have an image in a show that'll be down in Boston at the Lafayette Gallery that's run by the Griffin Museum. It's kind of a hallway that goes between Macy's and the Lafayette Place. The image I have is actually of a building in Chicago. And as I mentioned, I plan to be doing a talk on the Shakers sometime in the fall. Once again, they have a tie that their origination in the United States was outside of Albany, where the Albany airport is now, and basically it's about 7 miles from where I grew up. But I've spent the last 20 years or so going around to various Shaker villages and talk about getting books from the library. There is no shortage of information on the Shakers, so I'm kind of putting together a presentation that'll talk about their evolution and their influence on a lot of things. As certainly we're very familiar with the Shakers today and their furniture and their aesthetic, but they have a pretty interesting backstory. And there still are 2 active Shakers up in Sapathe Lake, Maine. So that's the presentation. Certainly welcome any thoughts or questions folks have.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was great. We had a lot of great compliments on the presentation. A lot of people looking forward to the recording so they can rewatch it with other people they know who have visited the region. Lots of great travel tips. Thank you for that. Let's see. Did anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask before? Linda says she's going to watch the hearings, but she will look forward to the recording. Excellent. That was great. Have you ever been in the mall that's underneath the food court that's underneath the plaza in Albany? There's like a big food court tunnel thing.
Well, there's a convention center underneath it.
Oh, right. Yeah, I've never been through there.
That's where our high school graduation was actually.
Oh, okay.
But we didn't, I mean, growing up, I did not, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and going into the city of Albany was not something you did very much. I mean, all of the shops had moved out to the malls.
Yeah.
And so, and like I said, this mall was under construction for years. It was just this hole in the ground for like a decade. And I said it was finished, obviously. I graduated high school in 1980. But I went to college for my last 3 years at SUNY Albany, and I actually learned more about Albany and spent more time in Albany in those 3 years than I did the previous 18. And it was just something I said was just interesting growing up, you know, in the United States in that time where everything was the total, you know, exodus from the city. All the malls were being built in the suburbs and everything else. And I remember going down to the Albany Library one time, and there was a homeless guy outside panhandling, and that like blew my mind. I was just, I'd never seen that before. And
Yeah, I worked there. There were still homeless people panhandling outside of the library. So it's changed a lot since I worked there. I think we're all set, Thomas. Sorry, we're closing up the library now. But yeah, Albany it's a neat place. But that was a great presentation. I have been down to FDR's home there in Valkill, but I didn't have a chance to go to the Culinary Institute. We wanted to go, but we couldn't get in, or we were it was the wrong time or something like that. I don't remember. But
yeah, they are. We were the first time you wanted to go. It was Easter weekend, and the whole school was shut down. So
oh yeah,
it is something that you have to plan a little bit, but it's not cheap. I would recommend lunch, but they're really and the students. It's great to interact with the students when they serve you. They're shy, but when you start asking some questions, they just open up. And the girl who served us she's going to graduate, and she wants to start a foraging business.
Oh,
Which was just very interesting. And we got into, she started, pulling out her phone and showing us pictures of morels and all this stuff. And it was,
cool.
It was pretty neat. So it's a cool place, but you definitely have to plan ahead. And of course, with COVID now, I mean, that's kind of the deal with a lot of these things. You got to make sure. We had tickets for Olana. We bought those in advance. Storm King, I think it is you just buy the $23 for the car. I don't think they don't time ticket that, but definitely everything you go to, you want to make sure that you're looking if they have time tickets or not.
Yeah, you definitely made me want to revisit that whole area. It is such a beautiful drive, or it can be in parts anyway.
Yeah, well, the Taconic Parkway, William Kenny has a famous quote. He said the Taconic Parkway is a 110-mile postcard. So it's definitely pretty. Getting there, not so much. I'm not a fan of 84,
Yeah.
but
I agree with you about 84. It's a pain. All right. Well, I guess I don't see that there are any other questions. I'm sure that if there are any questions, feel free to forward them on to me, and I will forward them to Bruce. Or if you know Bruce, go ahead and ask him. I'm sure he'd be willing to answer any questions you have. But yeah, that was wonderful, and we look forward to the Shakers presentation too in the fall. That should be really, really interesting.
Great. Thanks so much, Jess.
All right. Take care. Good night.